So good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at the College of the Holy Cross and the founder of the Catholics and Cultures Initiative. Together with my colleague, Matt Schmaltz, as the founding editor of the Journal of Global Catholicism, and with Mark as managing editor of the journal, we've been working to expand the ways we talk and think about contemporary Catholicism around the globe. And this series is one of the delightful ways that we get to do that. We've had a couple of these now, and now we get to travel to a different part of the globe in this series. So I'll just, Mark, leave it to you to introduce everyone and welcome. And thank the people who are on here and look forward to all the people who join us when this is posted online too.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. I'd like to welcome you and thank you again for taking the time to be part of this conversation about a wonderful new book. I'm Marc Loustau, the managing editor of the Journal of Global Catholicism, as Tom said. It's my pleasure to welcome the participants to our Author Meets Critics session today on Eric Hoenes Del Pinal's Guarded by Two Jaguars, a Catholic Parish Divided by Language and Faith, published by the University of Arizona Press. Eric is Associate Professor of Religious Studies. That's correct, yes? Great. Yeah, I know you just recently got tenure, so congratulations about that.
Thanks.
So I wanted to make certain I got the job title correct. He is the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, in Charlotte, North Carolina, United States. His research interests include the study of global Christianity, the politics of language and culture, and the ethnography of Latin America, with special emphasis on indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica. In alphabetical order, I'd like to introduce our other participants, our friendly and collegial critics for today's session. Katherine Dugan is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Springfield College, Massachusetts, USA. She is author of the monograph Millennial Missionaries, How a Group of Young Catholics is Trying to Make Catholicism Cool, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Kristy Nabhan-Warren of the University of Iowa is professor and V.O. and Elizabeth Kahl Figge Chair of Catholic Studies at the University of Iowa, also in the U.S. She is the author of many books and articles, most recently Meatpacking America, How Migration, Work, and Faith Unite and Divide the Heartland, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2021. Finally, Kinga Povedák is Research Fellow at the Research Group for the Study of Religious Culture at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and is also a joint appointment at the University of Szeged, Hungary. She specializes in religiosity of late modernity, Catholicism, and popular culture. She is the author of numerous articles, including Rock in the Church, Vernacular Catholic Musical Practices, and Hillsongization, Religious Ecumenism, and Uniformity, a Hungarian Case Study. Welcome and thanks again. Our agenda for today, Eric will make a few brief remarks on his book to frame our conversation. Then our panelists will offer their comments. I'll return to Eric to respond, and then I'll open things up to our audience to ask questions, and we'll finish at the hour mark. So right now, I'll turn things over to Eric.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Tom, for having me as part of the series. So as I was saying there before we officially started, right, I've been waiting for this to come out for a long time. It's been a long process. And in some ways, the genealogy of the project is far longer than most anthropological projects, because the church where this ethnographic study is set is one that I've been visiting probably since before I can remember. Now, not in the capacity of a parishioner, not in the capacity of a person of faith there, but sort of as a quasi-tourist, because the city of Goban, where this is the story that I tell in the book takes place, was the city where my father was born and where my grandfather lived, and so that whole side of the family is very rooted to that. And so, as a child, I would go visit there, and one of the things that you do when you go to Goban is you go up and visit the church that I call San Felipe here. So much later on, when I started to pursue a PhD in anthropology, and I was thinking about what I might do for a project, Koan seems like a sort of natural place for me to put my efforts, right? In part because I had this kind of shallow but long-term familiarity with the place, in part because I had a place to stay. And so grant dollars would go a little bit further in that case, but also because I'd really gotten interested in wanting to learn a little bit of Kekchi earlier on. So my grandfather had actually learned to speak Kekchi as a child. I think he was fluent in Kekchi before he learned Spanish, although none of his children learned it beyond a few phrases and mostly swear words. And so, at some point I thought it would be interesting to learn a bit of this language. And then as I started to develop as a scholar, I thought, well, this would be an interesting place to situate the work. And originally it was not going to be anything about Catholicism in particular, right? Originally this was a project that was all about the politics of language and looking at how what is sometimes called the Pan-Maya movement had galvanized in the post-war period in Guatemala around issues of language use. But I had found that there'd been quite a bit written already about how the state and educational institutions were dealing with language, right? That was sort of places that linguistic anthropologists had been looking. But the other places that indigenous languages were being used quite a bit in Guatemala were in the churches. And so I decided to sort of start the project there. And once I was there, I found out that there were absolutely issues around language use, but they were not the ones that I expected. They were less about sort of who counted as Kekchi and more about who counted as Catholic. And that's because the charismatic Catholic renewal movement had just started off in this parish. So this is kind of a new and going concern. And the book is really built around this debate or inter-parish conflict that was happening in the mid-2000s, right? Just a few years after charismatic Catholicism had started to be a concern here. And people were talking about language, complaining about, in particular, charismatic's use of Spanish, but really, what the argument that I try to make in the book, right, what this cuts down to is fundamental questions of how you define who gets to be Catholic, in particular, who gets to be indigenous and Catholic. And so the larger meta-argument in the book, right, is about using this case study as a way to think through Catholicism as a global institution, right? And to think about how these local level conflicts, the way that the people at this very micro level, right? Like the issues that I talk about here were not issues the next parish over, as far as I could tell. But they were about people trying to define their identity and try to engage in the global institution. And so drawing on my background in linguistic anthropology, the argument that I make here is that if we use sort of Mikhail Bakhtin's theories of heteroglossia, there's a way to think about the Catholic Church or Catholicism. I think when we say church, like, it's too easy to think about the institutional stuff, right? But if we think of Catholicism as a kind of lived religion, that looking at these local conflicts is a really productive way for thinking about the multiplicity of Catholicisms and the way that they interact with each other, right? So I think I will leave it there because I'm eager and curious to hear what everybody else has to say about the book.
All right, so I just want to situate a little bit about how I come to Eric's work here in this book. I will say that one of the dissertation paths for me not taken was a study of charismatic Catholics in and around Chicago. And so I've got a definite curiosity here and was excited to read about it. I also spent some time in my 20s traveling and homestaying in Guatemala while learning Spanish. And I'm a scholar of U.S. Catholicism, interested in conservative-oriented movements within the church. So I've had the privilege of hearing bits and pieces of Eric's project over the years at various conferences. And so it was with joy that I accepted Marc's invitation to think about this book. So I've got three themes I want to think through here and raise, and then a couple of questions. So the first one is that I readily admit that the theory of heteroglossia was a new one to me, but it is an analytic tool that I find super helpful in Eric's work, and I want to think here about its implications. Eric posits that Bakhtin's theory of language, heteroglossia, is a way to, quote, examine the heteroglot reality of Catholicism in contemporary Guatemala, end quote. Eric proposes that this model is a way to understand how Spanish and Kekchi not only coexist in uneasy relationship in San Felipe, but they also index identity, practices, bodily movements, and co-constituting versions of parish life. So one example strikes me as particularly rich. Eric notes the way that code switching works within members of the San Felipe parish. In his chapter on ritual, chapter 4, he observes that when a religious event becomes more fervent, he says, this is when folks switch from Spanish to Quechua. And he carefully reminds us, code switching is always a choice, not an accident. Eric argues that this linguistic move is interpreted differently by the two groups of parishioners. It is a good thing among the charismatics and a bad thing among the mainstream Catholics. This kind of fine-grained attention to detail is one of the strengths of Eric's work more broadly, but it is also one of the ways a heteroglossia helps us think here. This is not just about the presence of multiple languages in one parish space. This is about how those languages encode correct behavior and signal meaning both within and without the community. The second theme here that I am excited about is that Eric's book focuses on the life of a parish, an important intervention in the study of Catholicism. As Eric points out, scholars have, quote, missed some of the ways in which Catholics make the sacred local. I love that line. So my sociologist friends call this the meso level of interpretation, and I tend to agree with Eric. We have tended appropriately toward lived religion beyond the parish or institutional histories far above parish life. And especially within studies of Catholicism in Latin America, the emphasis on base ecclesial communities has perhaps obscured the role of parishes in Catholic life. So part of what I love about this book is how Eric situates San Felipe as a place where contestations over identity happen, the minutiae of a debate over which language a homily should be set in, or the frustration over the way a biblical passage gets interpreted. And perhaps my own childhood in a Catholic parish biases my take here, but that makes it resonate on a real level. Debates about what kinds of dessert should be served after Mass, or whether that altar server had actually fallen asleep during the homily, are the things of Catholic life. The last theme that I want to raise here for thinking is the subject of Eric's 6th chapter, which is on prayer. He calls embodied piety. For those of us who have spent any time studying or thinking about charismatic Catholicism, the body at prayer is an unavoidable locus of analysis. And Eric does it due justice, as he describes the loud, physical, exhausting vigilias that are more revivals than vigils. But what I love about this chapter is that when he is describing the mainstream Catholics and their bodies' stillness, their restrained hand gestures, and their bowed heads and kneeling legs, Eric is also clear that this is prayer embodied also. Both forms of Catholic practice are embodied. The reasons I love this are twofold. I love that a linguistic study of Catholic practice has to turn toward bodies. Eric's use of heteroglossia is not just about language choices, but also about body movements. Second, this chapter is also about how different body comportments index and communicate different versions of how to be Catholic to the other group, but also within their like community and to themselves. Eric's analysis of the commingling of internal prayer with embodied practices gestured to the ways that these communities are concerned about their own sustainability. Catholic identity here is a project, not an achievement. So, a handful of questions as I wrap up. I will admit I'm totally a sucker for positionality statements that anthropologists are so good at writing. So I loved reading, Eric, your own history with San Felipe, and I was struck how you described your return 10 years later. I wonder if you've shared this work with your family members, with the members of the community, and what kinds of responses you have received. I can imagine some nervousness, and I wonder about how that nervousness affects your ties to the community. Second, I come to this work outside of anthropology, and I'm always curious about when conversations within anthropology and religious studies sort of diverge. So I'm struck, Eric, by your closing insistence that Catholicism is unsettled. Of course it is. I absolutely agree. But I also think you are saying so much more in this book, and I don't think that many scholars within religious studies are concerned. Like, we all think, yeah, Catholicism is not static. But your insistence suggests that anthropologists are having a different version of this conversation. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the disciplinary intervention that you see this book making. And then more theoretically, finally, you can tell that I'm drawn to this idea of heteroglossia as a model for thinking about Catholicism. But I'm curious to hear, how far can this analytic be pushed? Glossia suggests language, but you include physical movements and political animus. Can we apply this model to other parishes, other countries, other contexts? How far can we go? And what are the limits as you have molded this model here? As you have molded this, what are the limits? So thank you, Eric, for this book, and I look forward to the rest of this conversation.
Well, Kate, those were amazing comments. It's gonna be hard to go after you. There's definitely there's gonna be some overlap, which I hopefully is fruitful and not repetitive or redundant. So it's so great to be here today. As Kate said, I myself too was very excited to be invited. Really, it's a pleasure to be here. My own positionality in religious studies, as I was trained in religious studies, trained as both a social historian of American religions as well as an ethnographer. So I was trained by historians as well as anthropologists like Michael Jackson, Carol Greenhouse, and Bob Orsi. So I came to this study, and I've known, like Kate, I've known about Eric's work for a while. I read an early draft, and so it's just incredible to be holding this book. And we were talking earlier, well, actually, I put a little sticky note. It's a great cover, I just have to say that. I edit a book series, as some of you know, and I'm really invested in book covers and making sure our authors have really great covers. And this is a great cover. So I want you to unpack the cover for us a little bit later. I also want to say briefly that most of my work these days is in administration, and it's just a pleasure to be able to exercise my academic professor faculty side. So thank you for that. So Eric's book is a study of religious differentiation, conflict, and change. His focus is on how people's religious affiliations are articulated, not in isolation, but in dynamic interaction with each other. I think this is a really important study in examining how intra-religious fissures, as he notes, we don't look oftentimes within one parish, as Kate notices. Intra-religious fissures, conflicts, and struggles emerge. And as Kate noted, and as Eric noted earlier, the dyad that he's looking at here with the intra is mainstream versus charismatic Catholics. This is a case study, and I'm a big fan of case studies. And as we all know, the very best case studies have to reach broader, and Eric's book certainly does this. It's a case study that has broader implications on how the rise of evangelicals and evangelicalism in Latin America and Central America and struggles and challenges. There are a lot of books out there, many of which Eric includes in his bibliography and the footnotes. And by the way, I really appreciate footnotes versus endnotes. As a reader, that was really helpful. We've read a lot about how evangelicalism is really challenging Roman Catholicism within Central Latin America, but we really don't have a lot of rich studies like Eric's out there that shows these intra-parish dynamics. I too, as with Kate, was really fascinated. I am nowhere near an expert or overly familiar with Bakhtin. And so I, as a Catholic studies scholar, was also really interested in how you use, Eric, Bakhtin's conception of language and discourse and how it can be metaphorically extended. And I was also intrigued with bodies and language. So I think there's a role there. And like Kate, I'd love to hear you say more later on, do you see this as an intervention, or maybe we're a place where religious studies scholars can connect with our anthropology? Because I think that we're all doing a lot of similar things, but I'm also curious about what you hope to see with this intervention, not only for anthropologists of religion, but for religious studies folks as well. So I too was entranced by this. I was really intrigued by a quote that you had, like I think it was page 112. Like all ethnographers, I'm trying to render into writing the disorienting experience of finding the strange familiar and the familiar strange. So I read this book primarily, I think, as an ethnographer of religion who has spent most of my career deeply embedded in Catholic communities, mostly US Latinos, but also Congolese Catholics as well in my more recent work. And so I was really wanting to hear more about that disorienting experience and that positionality. And it got me thinking about the study of religion in general, about being a disorienting experience, whether we're ethnographers, historians, how studying others' religious worlds, whether it's archival or in the field, how that can be just incredibly disorienting. So it really got me thinking about our method as a disorienting one. I also really liked how you pointed to whether or not this was a major contribution you intended. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. On page 56, you really hint at the limits of enculturation, sort of post-Vatican II enculturation. And you show that the Catholic Church in Alta Verapaz, you show this disconnect between religious leadership, a Congolese priest in this case, trying to latch onto post-Vatican II enculturation, and not really getting it. He's not really getting, it seems, what's going on in his parish. And he seems a bit dismissive. We'll just figure it out. We all have to inhabit this space. And I'd love to hear more about the positionality of the priest. I've been thinking a lot about priests in contemporary, Roman Catholic worlds. And is enculturation a concept that is maybe heteroglossia is more helpful than enculturation? I'm wondering how the two might work together, the two frameworks. Finally, and I was hoping it would be okay to read a little selection from your book, because I was really captivated by your writing. As someone who has done a lot with embodiment and religious studies, and I know I saw Steve Selka here. Steve and I have chapters coming out in an edited volume on the phenomenology. It's sort of an homage to Michael Jackson. I really appreciate, Eric, your close and careful examination of lived religion and how you attend to the embodiment, not only of your interlocutors, but your own body. And thinking of some of our Catholic studies scholar colleagues, I was thinking of Alyssa Maldonado Estrada's work, her first book, and her new book on the Rosary. I was thinking about Susan Reynolds, whom you quote extensively. Both of their work is also located in parishes, but it's also deeply embodied. And so I'm also thinking a lot about how focusing on a parish and ethnographers of religion, our deep embeddedness within parishes, can really connect sort of a phenomenological approach as well as a close study of parishes. So I was thinking about these two. And your chapter, Bodies That Carry, I was really moved by that. It made me think of Orsi's, his first book, Madonna of 115th Street. I was thinking about Alyssa's book, her beautiful book on men's devotions. And so if it's okay for me to read from your Bearing the Collective Cross, this is Eric. It was seasonably warm and sunny day, and we had already been walking for over 2 hours before the time came to fulfill the Hermandad de la Catedral's invitation to carry the Viernes Santo Anda, which featured Jesus lying in state after his death. We walked trailing behind the Santo in the procession's tail, and at each change of turno, our group got closer and closer to the Santo's bier until it was finally our time. As the tallest person by several inches in my group, I've never had that problem or issue, so I sort of chuckled a little bit. I was shuttled to the very last place on the left hand side of the bier and watched as one by one my companions took their spots. Then it was my turn to glide my right shoulder into place under the bier. The physical experience of carrying the Santo came as a shock. I was thinking again about the disorientation that you write about. I immediately felt the tonnage of the Anda pressing down on my shoulder. The wood was hard. There was no padding, and its edges, though slightly rounded, felt sharp. That's on 217 toward the end of your book. I loved how you gave us this rich description of sort of how uncomfortable it is to carry this, but also how uncomfortable it is, disorienting to study religion. And I think I was anticipating, I had questions for you, like what's next? And is there going to be sort of a method and theory piece that you're working on? Because you say so much about embodied research. So I'll stop now, but my last question is really what's next? Where do you see yourself going after this lovely book, which I will be assigning in my seminar? So thank you, Eric, for just a lovely book, and it was a pleasure to read.
So hello, everyone. I don't know if Eric needs more questions because there's already a nice plethora of questions, but I will be adding some to the list. So first of all, thank you, Mark, for the invitation and being, having the possibility to participating in this. And of course, congratulations, Eric, on this wonderful and vivid ethnography and a very interesting book. So I guess I'm someone who actually coming from completely outside of the specific geographical context discussed in the book, but then also coming from outside the North American academic world. So actually it was with this approach of being a double outsider that I picked up the book. However, immediately after beginning to read the introduction, I realized the various aspects and concepts and topics discussed in your book that really it spoke to me so much to my specific fieldwork experiences and to my expertise on congregational musicking in Catholic, charismatic, and Pentecostal contexts within Hungary. Surprisingly, but I also very much appreciated your application of Bakhtin's theory of heteroglossia as a way of showcasing how there is multivocality in a seemingly singular and monologic institution of the Catholic Church, showing us through discussing the debates between Catholics and Catholic charismatics of one particular Guatemalan parish, how there are different Catholicisms with different embodied experiences, with different sensorial and aesthetic preferences, with different ways of dealing with religious authority. And I was intrigued by the ways in which you utilize the debates between the mainline Catholics and the Catholic charismatics as a perfect way to demonstrate how religious imaginaries are formed, contested, and changed. And partly also because I did something similar in my dissertation. I was digging into the worship wars and the liturgical wars within Hungarian Catholicism, and then kind of working from those debates and how their religious views have been contested and so on. Now, Bakhtin coined the term heteroglossia to explain how language is not a static monolithic entity, but rather a dynamic and ever-changing system that reflects the social, historical, and ideological context in which it is used. And you explain this well in the book. And for Bakhtin, heteroglossia describes the coexistence of multiple voices, languages, and discourses within a particular cultural or linguistic community. But in your work, Eric, luckily, and I think it's wonderful that you don't only include language and gesture, but you go way beyond in your discussions, and you include the ethnographies of the aesthetic preferences, of the sensorial engagements, and of the embodied experiences during prayers, during the singing and the musicking, or the Holy Week processions. So for me, this goes way beyond language and gestures. And so let me phrase somehow a question here. How would you see your work if you looked at it or framed it within the lived religion paradigm, or how does it go with the heteroglossia? How does it work somehow together? And let me throw in another expression there. I'm not sure whether you are familiar with the work of late folklorist and religious studies scholar Leonard Premiano on vernacular religiosity. Which is in many ways similar to the popular religion and to the lived religion paradigm, but in many ways different. And as Leonard Premiano coins and focuses on, he talks about vernacular religion as the ambiguous nature of people's religion, the significance of creativity and artistry to religious life, and the relationship of religious creativity to forms of power, in particular as contestation to that of power. And I think that very much speaks to several issues and particular topics that you are discussing in your text as well. So my question is just kind of, just put it heteroglossia, vernacular religiosity, lived religion, just put it somewhere there. I have further comments concerning your chapter, of course, on congregational musicking. I think you make a great contribution in explaining how musical practices can also become an important point of connection, enabling individuals to locate themselves in the social and cultural space. I was very interested, it was very interesting to read about the linguistic code switching in your research, Parish. And it's very interesting how I find a striking similarity with my work with the Hungarian Roma communities, but there's no linguistic code switching, rather a musical code switching. Yeah, so they are kind of doing this in order to express their politics of belonging. So my question here concerns the politics of belonging of the Catholic charismatics. What keeps them with the mainline Catholics? And I'm particularly interested whether they develop, other than what you described, whether they have developed Catholic practices that would differentiate them from the Pentecostals. What I mean here is, for instance, that in Hungary, Catholic charismatics have this very similar practices, very similar music to the Pentecostals. However, they invent now new Catholic charismatic rituals in order to express their Catholicness, right? So one example would be the adoration of the Eucharist, which is super Catholic, like you cannot go more Catholic than the Eucharist. And then so they are standing in line as receiving the communion, but instead the priest is holding the Eucharist, and then they just line up and bow and then go back to their places, and then they do this. So that kind of rituals I'm thinking about. So do you see efforts of Catholic charismatics to come up with distinctive features to create these borders or boundaries in a sense? And in conclusion, I just want to point to one of the important comments you make in the book, how Hermano Rigo speaks about how it was music that initially drew him into the La Renovación, to the Catholic renewal movement, to the Catholic charismatics. And of course, you further elaborate on being hymns, of hymns being the site for producing a congregational difference, but also the grounds of identity. And I think this is an important observation because, unfortunately, the role of music in vernacular religious experiences has not yet been sufficiently assessed. I think music and also the lyrics of the religious song repertoire contain an incredibly important and untapped source untapped resource for research. And you showed us some song lyrics, which was great. And I see these texts as, one of the best expressions of what you call the heteroglossia of Catholicism. A great expression for what one might call vernacular theologies, right? So because, as we know, these popular hymnodies, the popular hymnodies are oftentimes become an expression of what people believe, and sometimes they are more reliable indicators of popular belief than the creedal confessions, right? So finally, I would be interested in your take on the role of music and the importance of the role of music for the parish, in particular, that you researched, and maybe if you could reflect on possible ways of new musical epistemologies for the religious studies or for the anthropology of Christianity. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our commentators. And Eric, I'll turn it back over to you for about 10 minutes If you can, pick and choose a few questions to respond to, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So audience members, please do prepare. If you have any questions, we'd love to have them.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think certainly in 10 minutes I can thoroughly address all the questions that came out of this. No, and I'm happy to hear this, right? Because, just to sort of disclose a little about the process of writing on the book, there was a long while when I thought I wasn't going to write a monograph and that I was just going to write a bunch of articles, but I never ended up finishing any of the articles or submitting them anywhere, which meant that, eventually I was having to find a way to structure together all these, what began as disparate pieces coming out of the process of ethnography, and trying to find some way to mesh it all together. I think it did come together, but it didn't come together for me really until I started revisiting the Bakhtinian theory, right? So as somebody who had in his doctoral program a lot of training in linguistic anthropology, right, Bakhtin was sort of one of our main things that we read about, right? And there was this kind of moment, if you're not familiar with linguistic anthropology, there was this kind of moment where the kind of Bakhtinian theory of heteroglossa people really latched onto that to say, like, look, here's a way that linguistic anthropologists can stop doing the kind of just focusing on grammatical structures and find a way to move from analyzing language in use to thinking about how this produces something like a social theory for us. And so that's really what I'm building on there. Adding also the chunk that's sort of developing at the time, what some folks are now calling the embodied sociolinguistics, right? To think about how language is not just words on a page or sound waves in the air, but is something that's produced and received by bodies. And then, of course, once you start paying attention to gesture and body posture and eye gaze and all those sorts of things, right, you realize that there's a kind of irreducible complexity to human communication too, and that a tremendous amount of work is being done through that. So it's when I sort of came back to that I realized that really what we were dealing with here was all sorts of different semiotic things that were doing the same kind of processes of, creating differentiation, but also, as Kinga was saying about the music, right? Like what does the music do, right? Like on the one hand, it's about creating a sense of belonging when everybody's singing together. When you think about it outside of just the people who are singing, but also the people who are listening, you're thinking also about how there's different groups involved, and you got the process of differentiation. When you ground it in kind of embodied experiences, there's the pleasure of singing, right? Which was one of those other things that I thought was kind of disorienting about doing ethnography, to go to one of Kristy's points, right? Was, man, when you're in a church and there's music, it's hard to not sing. And yet I had heard other anthropologists of religion like really talking about being resistant about participating in that, because, they sort of wanted to be the detached observers. I had one of my mentors, talked about allowing himself only to tap his feet while in Pentecostal services. And I thought that's really missing a lot of, if we want to take seriously what participant observation is as a methodology in anthropology and religious studies, like you gotta be in it, right? There's a very old piece by Margaret Mead that I think was an address to AAA, or maybe to AAAS or something like that, where she talks about the irreproducibility of the subjective experience of being an ethnographer, right? So I think the strand of thinking has been there for a while, but we don't always making it explicit, because if we think about ethnography as being primarily about doing the kind of interviewing stuff, right, and being able to access information from other people in those ways, we miss a lot of what is actually rich and productive about doing ethnographic work, and that's presence, right? That's the simple act of presence, and of being part of things, right? So going ahead and singing and allowing yourself to enjoy the singing, allowing your mouth to make the sounds in a different language also gives you a sense of what's going on there, right? That idea too, that when you sing it, you're also doing this kind of linguistic act of making a kind of statement, right? And there's a section there where I talk about what it means to actually voice those things. So yeah, if we want to think about this sort of methodologically, right, that would be my contribution there, and to think across the registers of everything that's happening, to really try to get something complex, to still maybe aim for what Gertz called the thick description, right? Which when I teach this, I like to point out to students, thick description doesn't mean more description. Right, thick description is not about adding more and more details. It's about uncovering different layers of meaning that exist within those details. Yeah, I'm really glad that the Bakhtin stuff worked for you all, and that it seems like it might be productive. I wasn't sure if that was going to work for scholars of Catholicism at all. I think there's been this moment where people use that complexio oppositorum idea to want to think about how we might model the institution as this flexible structure with different meanings within it. But I thought the heteroglossic stuff allowed us to do something to produce an even more complicated model of things that might be going on, right? That isn't just sort of about opposites and tensions, but sometimes it's about how things come together. Picking and choosing here, what to talk about, right? The sort of the moment of return for me to the field. So I'd been gone for a while, and then I came back, and if you'd asked me when I left the first time, or as I was writing that dissertation, right, my prediction was like, yeah, the split's going to continue. Eventually the charismatics will get fed up with all of this, and they'll probably do what the mainstream Catholics were accusing them of, and just go be Pentecostals, because why not? Like, who needs that headache? And in fact, something very different had happened, right? That the whole dynamics in the parish had changed, and you had something that Jacob Sorthen, who's on the call here, has called, right, this kind of incipient Pentecostalization had happened, where the mainstream Catholics had in fact adjusted their forms of ritual in ways that made them seem much more like what the charismatics were before. Not exactly Pentecostalized all the way, right? But there was a different kind of texture and feeling to their things, and that's because there was this top-down institutional moves to do something that they called La Santa Misión Popular, the Holy Mission of the People, that was precisely a kind of institutional attempt to respond to the continued growth of Pentecostalization by making a new set of Catholic rituals that were, kind of more cosmopolitan and public-facing. But what happened was that, of course, a lot of people who had been invested in the models of enculturation and on the the sort of like the very Kekchinas of being Kekchian Catholic, some of them said, no, you're trying to make us not Kekchi anymore. So they have since sort of doubled down on the Kekchinas, and it created new conflicts, right? So one of the advantages of the fact that I dithered on writing articles for a long time that I never published is that by the time I went back and saw things, right, there was a real chance to see with fresh eyes what I had seen in the mid-2000s from a fresh vantage point, right, and to sort of know how the story had turned out, right, to know at least, or at least like what the next chapter in the soap opera was, right, because that was maybe 6-ish years ago, 7 years ago, when I was looking at those things again. And once again, right, there's a generation of new sets of questions and conflicts that are coming up for people. So that again is sort of a chance to think about how the different debates, disagreements, minor conflicts, right, over things both really important and kind of trivial, create the texture of the continuing life, right? How things keep going. So if we think about that in terms of the sort of lived religion paradigm, right, that certainly that idea would gets us there to always think about how people create and produce things anew. I've always sensed, and maybe this is not fair because I didn't, wasn't fully trained in this, but I've always sensed that the lived religion paradigm tends to be much more localized, right? It's kind of like the individual or the family, and it's not this meso-level theorization, right? And thinking as an anthropologist, I want to think about how groups do things, right? And so thinking about how here's one of the ways that what I'm doing may be different from lived religion, is the sense that it's, you know, at some level it's about groups coming to consensus about how to do things, right? And that doesn't mean that individuals or families aren't doing that either, or, you know, the base communities aren't each have their own way, but also wanting to think about how collectively people are hashing that out is maybe one way that what I'm doing here is a little bit different from the lived religion paradigm. To answer Kinga's question about the vernacular religion, right? That's another one that concept that I thought a little bit about, although I don't think I address it specifically in the book. And you know what strikes me there, right, is that what Bakhtin would say is that all languages are vernaculars, right? It's just that some of them are able to accrue power onto themselves in certain ways to make the claim that they're official languages and not just vernaculars, right? And so again, I think the Bakhtinian perspective helps us to recognize that all of this is vernacular, right? The priest's vision of Catholicism was also a vernacular because, you know, he was from Congo and went to seminary in Cameroon, right? And then got posted in Mexico for a while without knowing a word of Spanish, and then got sent to Guatemala and to this parish without knowing a word of Quechua. And so he was also very much in a position of trying to figure out what things might be like for him. You know, and he was not the first Congolese nor the last in the parish, but he also, you know, was part of a generation of Central Africans that inherited the parish from Filipinos who had inherited it from Belgians. You know, and those national differences, I think, would also make a difference, right? So to think about all of these as overlapping vernaculars, but then to want to think about, well, so how then are structures maintained so that certain vernaculars make the claim that now they're in fact the real version of it, would be a way to complicate that, I think.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you again to our commentators. And I'm going to open it up to the audience to see if any folks have questions. Maybe you can raise a hand or either with Zoom or your actual hand if you have a question, and we can then unmute yourself. I actually do have a question myself, if folks would like another few minutes to think things through. Oh, Steve Selka has raised his hand, and so I'll turn it over to Steve. I prefer to hear Steve speak than me, so I'll give it to Steve.
I love hearing your voice too, so thank you very much. I have more just thanks than a specific question, including on a couple of counts. First of all, for great work that is going to be helpful in it's going to be helpful for me finishing up my own second book, which deals with code switching and I guess heteroglossia in a broad way, as a way to talk about and think about religious syncretism, Afro-Catholic religious syncretism in a fresh manner. The other thing, and you know, I've also noted, being an anthropologist in a department of religious studies, I've also been in a situation where I brought Bakhtin into the conversation, and my colleagues around the table weren't yet familiar with Bakhtin and heteroglossia, and how rich those analytical perspectives are, and how useful they can be for the kinds of things that we do. And anyway, the other thanks that I wanted to offer to you is the other thing about being an anthropologist in the Department of Religious Studies. I've heard several times colleagues refer to the model of parish studies in Catholic studies in a derogatory way. Mm-hmm. And and so those colleagues are probably referring to a kind of stale, model of early Catholic studies that I'm not very familiar with. But I think what your book does is provides a great example of what's important and generative and exciting about parish studies, right? I mean, you're doing obviously what you're writing is not simply of interest to people who are interested in this parish. So it's a great example of ethnography that opens itself up to various, readers who have diverse interests and things like that. Anyway, so thanks and congratulations, and good to see you.
Thank you.
And everyone else
great to see
too.
you.
And I'll piggyback and jump on to what Steve was saying. I'm familiar with that exact trope of parish studies being somehow the enemy, or I'm not sure, an old-fashioned form. It's especially prevalent in historical disciplines, where parish histories seem to be the old-fashioned model for how to study Catholicism. And Kinga might be familiar with this because it's actually seems to be the old-fashioned form of studying the history of Catholicism, especially in Eastern Europe, in Hungary and Romania. So to refresh, to perhaps be innocent of that debate or innocent of that history, and coming at it from a perspective of anthropology, coming at the phenomenon of the parish, it would perhaps kind of add some fresh insight into that tension within the study of history, at least. Kinga, go ahead.
Can I just jump on that and then just throw in a comment that even though it was historically incorporated into some of our disciplines in Eastern Europe, for instance, but then on the other hand, for instance, Chris Hahn, anthropologist Chris Hahn, very much calls for, for ethnographies in the lack, and he really just calls for that there is a lack of ethnographies in Catholicism, in Episcopalian Church, and so on. And even I think the Anthropology of Global Catholicism book, there is also in the very beginning they address this issue that, well, we don't really have good ethnographies, and this is very good, very vivid, wonderful ethnography, and there is a need for more of this. Yes, just wanted to say.
One of the things that Eric, you mentioned that I wanted to just sort of take a step further, when you were talking about allowing ethnographers allowing themselves to sing, not going beyond the foot tapping, to actually participating in singing, which is also to say participating in prayer, because singing and prayer are oftentimes very similar technologies. To allow yourself to, as an ethnographer, to participate in that is to allow yourself to be changed to a fundamental degree, to allow your body and the ways that your body knows to be changed. And I think what's going on there, and one of the reasons why anthropologists are so reluctant to go beyond toe tapping, is because of this fear of conversion. And I think as a discipline, as we develop more nuanced language about conversion, or about at least embodied transformation in religious contexts, we can perhaps also develop a more nuanced language around positionality and what it means to participate to do participant observation in communities that are driven by and formed around a sense of divine presence.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, and I sort of, I toy with that, right, in my prose at the end of the music language, right, where I sort of say, as you're playing this, and what does it sound like? I'm kind of a, what do you call it, kind of natural atheist, right, or an agnostic, if I'm like being self-critical. So I've never been a part of a church, or thought of myself as belonging to any religion. But it was interesting because several times, right, in those communal moments of the church, I was like, you know what, I should probably just get baptized. Like, this would make sense. It would make people here happy, and like, I should probably just do it, right? And then I'd go home and have lunch, and then I'd be like, that's not a thing I'm gonna do. But it was another one of those moments, right? Because it's useful to do that, right? And I'm teaching like our theory and methods class in religious studies right now, right? And some students have recently read Durkheim and all of that, right? But if you sort of think about that, right, and like the communal experiences and the feelings of that, right, like being able to access some of those thoughts and experiences is really how we get at understanding religious phenomena. Now there is the question of like, so what are the limitations, right, and what's ethical and not ethical to do in those kinds of cases? But yeah, I was sort of guided by, if people wanted me to do this stuff, I would do it, because that was part of being a participant observer, right? So I muddled my way through the Rosary Prayer in Kekchi one time, book in hand, and that didn't make it into the book, but that also sort of gave me insight into what the cadences of prayer were like, right? And the kneeling for the long times, the fact that I could write that section that Kristy read about carrying the thing in the procession. I could only write that because I did it, and because I had the bodily sensory memories of that. Thinking about any of my field notes or any of my thoughts on the processions that I watched as opposed to participated in, it's a wholly different experience, right? And you can sort of propositionally know that carrying hurts and that you do it, but it's a whole other thing to actually get under the thing and to feel that wood, right? And then to be able to be sitting down more than a decade later trying to recreate that so that I can put it on page, right, depended so heavily on how impactful that was, right? Those memories, trying to access that, was just couldn't have done it if I hadn't done it, I guess, is a tautological and poor way to put it.
Are there any last questions from the audience? Seeing no other hands raised, I will say thank you to our panelists once again. Thank you to Tom Landy and Matt Schmaltz for helping us organize the whole series of Author Meets Critics sessions through the Catholics and Cultures program. And again, a special thank you, deep gratitude to Eric for finally finishing the book and putting all of those unpublished articles into one place and synthesizing them together. We are very grateful, and I'm sure that this book will continue to have an influence on the discipline, multiple disciplines going forward. Thank you to everyone for coming, and have a wonderful morning or afternoon, depending upon wherever you are watching this program. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye,
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye.